The smell of damp leaves and soil clung to the air as I made my way into the woods, where the forgotten cemetery lay hidden, swallowed by decades of neglect. I'd been tasked by the local historical society to document and restore the site, a small cemetery from the 1800s that had faded from memory. According to old records, it was used by a local family who once owned the land, but time and tragedy had obscured most of its story. The project excited me initially. I had spent years exploring old ruins, abandoned houses, and even a few graveyards in the name of preservation. But something about this place felt different from the beginning, even before I set eyes on the site. I'd heard stories, whispered by townsfolk and hinted at by the society members who handed me the assignment, about the girl buried there, Clara, and how her spirit might still linger in the cold ground. The cemetery was deep in the forest, hidden from view. I parked my truck at the edge of the woods, my only connection to the rest of the world, and grabbed my tools and gear. The walk to the cemetery was treacherous. The twisted roots of old trees snaked across the path, and thick underbrush clawed at my clothes and skin. No marked trail led to the cemetery. I was following vague directions and hoping I'd recognize it when I saw it. The sun was starting to set, casting the forest in an orange glow that made the shadows lengthen and shift. I finally reached a small clearing, where a chill that had nothing to do with the air's temperature ran down my spine. Just ahead, obscured by a layer of creeping ivy and fallen branches, were the first grave markers, faded, cracked stones half sunk into the earth, with names barely visible. This was the place. A sinking feeling overtook me as I stepped closer, brushing aside vines to reveal more headstones. There were no more than a dozen, arranged in a rough semicircle around a large oak tree. Its gnarled branches spread out over the graves, as though shielding them. I kneeled beside one of the stones and squinted, trying to read the name carved into it. Clara Bellamy, 1856 to 1873. Something about the name resonated within me, though I couldn't place why. Clara Bellamy had died young, just 17, the same age as my little sister. A strange emotion took root in my chest, a mixture of sorrow and protectiveness, as if I knew Clara or could somehow feel her spirit lingering in the space between her grave and the forest around it. And then, just as I was leaning in to brush away more moss, I felt it. A presence, unmistakable and cold, standing just at the edge of the clearing. I froze, my breath hitching. I could sense someone there, watching. Slowly, I raised my eyes, half expecting to see a deer or another animal watching me from the tree line. But it wasn't an animal. It was a girl. She stood there, silent and still, her face mostly obscured by the shadows cast by the tree branches. She wore a long, faded dress that looked out of place, as if it belonged to a different era. Her hair was dark, tumbling over her shoulders in waves. Even in the dim light, I could see her eyes glistening, her expression a mixture of sadness and something else, something like gratitude. I blinked, and just like that, she was gone. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat as I scanned the edge of the clearing, looking for any sign of her. But the forest was empty, still and silent except for the rustling of leaves in the wind. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I was probably just seeing things, I told myself, shadows and the eerie silence playing tricks on my mind. But even as I tried to dismiss it, the feeling of being watched lingered, a weight pressing down on my shoulders. Shaking it off, I turned back to Clara's grave and began to set up my tools. I had a job to do. I was here to document the graves, take photos, and clear away the overgrowth. I needed to catalog each stone, noting the inscriptions and their condition so that restoration could begin. Still, the thought of the girl remained lodged in my mind. Who was she? A local who had come to pay her respects, maybe? But that didn't make sense. No one had mentioned any visitors. This place had been abandoned for decades, forgotten by all but a few. As I worked, clearing the vines and leaves away from the stones, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see her again. But the woods remained empty, and the shadows grew longer as dusk settled in, casting an almost ethereal glow over the graves. As I cleared away the ivy from another headstone, I found myself whispering softly to the graves. "Don't worry," I said, as if they could hear me. "We'll take care of this place. Make sure you're remembered." A shiver ran through me at the words, and for a moment, I could swear I felt a warmth brush against my cheek, like a gentle hand. I turned around, but of course no one was there. The sun was almost completely down now, the light fading to a murky purple as night took over the forest. I packed up my tools, feeling a strange reluctance to leave. I had done what I could for today, but the place felt unfinished, as if something still needed to be done, something important. As I made my way back to my truck, I glanced over my shoulder one last time, half expecting to see the girl again. But the clearing was empty, the graves now nothing more than dark shapes against the ground. But just before I turned away, I thought I saw a faint, flickering light near Clara's grave. A soft, warm glow that vanished almost as soon as it appeared, like a candle being snuffed out. I walked away, the image of Clara's name etched firmly in my mind, and the memory of that girl's sorrowful gaze haunting me, lingering like the scent of wet earth and old leaves. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, watching, waiting. Waiting for what? I didn't know. But as I drove home, her face stayed with me, a pale, sorrowful visage that seemed to call out for help, or maybe something else. I had a feeling I would be seeing her again. I couldn't shake the image of the girl's face, her solemn eyes, that look of gratitude mixed with sorrow. It followed me home, lingering in my thoughts long after I'd left the cemetery. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, standing there at the edge of the trees watching. The next morning, I arrived at the Historical Society office early. The archives were housed in a small, dimly lit room at the back of the building, packed floor to ceiling with ancient records, crumbling ledgers, and dusty photos. I could practically feel the weight of the town's past in the air, like an unseen presence that watched me from every yellowed page. I sifted through old newspaper articles and family records, hoping to learn more about Clara Bellamy and the other people buried in that small cemetery. At first, I found nothing but mundane mentions, a marriage here, a business transaction there. But after hours of scanning through brittle records, I found a single mention of her name. August 1873. Tragedy struck the Bellamy family last month as Clara Bellamy, daughter of Edwin and Martha Bellamy, passed away under mysterious circumstances. Clara was 17. Services were held privately, and the family declined to comment. That was it. Just a few lines tucked away at the bottom of an old newspaper. No details about the circumstances, no official cause of death. Just mysterious circumstances. I kept digging, pulling up death records, birth certificates, anything that might offer more context. But every piece of information I found only added to the mystery. I learned that the Bellamy family had been wealthy landowners in the mid-1800s, their estate sprawling across acres of farmland. By the early 1900s, however, the family had faded from town records, with no living descendants in the area. The remaining land had been sold off and eventually swallowed by the encroaching forest. It was as if the Bellamys had vanished, taking their secrets with them. Just as I was about to give up, I found a thin, leather-bound notebook at the back of the archive shelf, nearly lost amid stacks of other documents. It was labeled simply Bellamy Family Ledger and dated from the mid-1800s. My hands trembled as I opened it, my mind racing with the possibility of learning more about Clara. The ledger was filled with meticulous entries, records of livestock purchases, crop yields, household expenses. But near the back, the handwriting changed. The tidy script turned jagged, desperate. A single page held my attention. August 14, 1873. Our beloved Clara has been laid to rest, though the memory of her passing shall haunt these woods forever. May God forgive us for what we have done. May she find peace, though I fear she may never forgive us. My pulse quickened as I read the words again. There was something hauntingly final in them, a sense of guilt that practically seeped from the ink. But the entry ended abruptly with no more explanation. The ledger offered no clues beyond that, only silence. That evening, despite the chill that settled in my bones, I returned to the cemetery. I brought a flashlight, not eager to be caught in the growing darkness of the forest, and a notebook to jot down my observations. The air felt different that night, heavier, somehow, and laced with the smell of damp leaves and earth. As I walked among the graves, I felt that same eerie sensation of being watched, just as I had the day before. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me, shifting in ways that defied the faint light of my flashlight. I focused on my task, brushing leaves off of each headstone, taking photos and noting down names. Clara's grave was the last one I visited. As I knelt beside it, a gust of wind swept through the clearing, rustling the leaves and stirring the loose earth. My flashlight flickered, casting the cemetery in momentary darkness before stabilizing again. I knelt down, brushing away the damp leaves and bits of debris from Clara's grave, feeling an almost instinctual need to clear it, as if she were watching me, judging my dedication. And then, somewhere in the distance, I heard it, a soft, muffled sound, like someone quietly crying. My pulse pounded as I strained to listen. The sound was faint, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. It echoed through the trees, surrounding me in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. The crying stopped instantly, replaced by a profound silence. For a moment I considered leaving, but something rooted me in place, something that felt both protective and responsible. I wanted to help, even if I didn't understand why or how. And then I saw her again. She was standing near the tree line, the same spot as before. Her form was barely more than a shadow, but her face was clear, pale, delicate, and framed by dark curls. Her eyes met mine, filled with that same tearful gratitude I'd seen before. She lifted her hand slightly, as if to reach out to me, and I could feel the urge to go to her, to help her somehow, whatever that meant. I took a step forward, and as I did, she began to fade, her form dissipating like mist until she was gone, leaving only the stillness of the forest behind. But as I turned back to Clara's grave, my flashlight illuminating the cracked stone, I saw something new. A single white flower, freshly laid across the dirt. Its petals were perfectly preserved, stark and pale against the dark soil, as though it had just been placed there. I reached out to touch it, half expecting it to be an illusion, but it was real, soft and cool beneath my fingers. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding, and whispered, "Is this what you want? Do you need help?" The air seemed to shift, a faint breeze swirling around me, almost like a sigh. The weight of sorrow felt even more palpable, almost suffocating. I felt certain that Clara's spirit was lingering here, bound to this place by something beyond my understanding. I left the cemetery that night feeling shaken, haunted by her presence. I was certain that Clara's ghost was real, trapped here, and that her gratitude hid a deeper pain, something that wanted to be freed. Back home, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and replaying the events of the night in my mind. The crying, her tearful expression, the flower that had appeared from nowhere. It all pointed to something left unfinished, some part of her story still demanding to be told. The next morning, I reached out to a local historian named Mrs. Hargrove, an elderly woman who had lived in town her whole life and knew more about its history than anyone else. When I mentioned Clara Bellamy, she fell silent for a long moment. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I haven't heard that name in years. They don't tell her story anymore. Too many people came away feeling disturbed. What happened to her?" I asked, my voice steady, though my heart raced. "They say," Mrs. Hargrove began, her voice growing heavier, "that she died of a broken heart, abandoned by the only family she had left. But there are other stories, darker ones. Stories that claim she died alone in those woods, left to the mercy of her family's shame." My mouth went dry. "Do you think her spirit is still there?" "I don't just think it," Mrs. Hargrove replied, a strange gleam in her eye. "I know it, and if you're wise, young man, you'll let her rest. Some things are better left undisturbed." But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't ignore the way she had looked at me, the silent plea in her eyes, as if she needed me to finish something that she couldn't. As I ended the call, Mrs. Hargrove's warning echoed in my mind. but it only fueled my resolve. Clara's story wasn't over, not yet, and I had a feeling that I was about to uncover something that went far beyond a simple haunting. The next day, I gathered my tools and headed back to the cemetery, ignoring the nervous twist in my stomach. I felt an almost obsessive compulsion to go there, as if something were pulling me. I'd been to plenty of abandoned places over the years, but none had affected me like this one. I couldn't forget the sorrow on Clara's face or that white flower, delicate and fresh, laid over her grave. As I reached the edge of the cemetery, I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself. The forest was still, too still, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation. Sunlight filtered through the trees, but the place felt no warmer. It was as though the air itself was waiting, suspended, sensing my purpose. I cleared away debris from around the headstones, pulling up weeds that had twisted their way through the graves over the years. I didn't realize how much time had passed until the light began to dim. Hours had flown by in near silence, punctuated only by the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. But every so often, I felt an almost comforting warmth, a presence beside me that didn't feel hostile, almost as if someone were helping me. The strange occurrences started subtly. I would set my tools down to clear debris and come back to find that some of the vines I had been working on had already been cleared. At first, I thought I'd simply done more than I remembered, lost in the rhythm of work. But as the day wore on, it became unmistakable. Certain gravestones seemed to clean themselves. Sections I hadn't yet touched appeared clear and orderly, even pristine. And then, there was Clara's grave. The stone, which had been barely readable the previous night, was suddenly clear of moss and vines. Her name and the date of her death stood out, as fresh and sharp as if the engraving had been done only yesterday. I hadn't touched it. I knew that for a fact. My tools had been nowhere near it. A prickling sensation crept up my arms as I stared at the stone. It felt as if she were with me, not just watching, but actively helping me, grateful for the care I was taking with her grave. A flicker of relief washed over me at the thought that maybe, by helping her rest, I could ease her sorrow. I spent the rest of the day clearing the overgrown cemetery. Every now and then, I thought I could hear faint whispers, just on the edge of hearing. They sounded soft, mournful, and were gone as soon as they came. The air seemed to thicken with each hour that passed, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. By dusk, I was exhausted. My hands were raw and sore from clearing brambles, and my knees ached from kneeling on the cold, uneven ground. But the cemetery looked different, felt different too. The graves, though still weathered and cracked, seemed almost proud now, their names visible, the overgrowth stripped away to reveal the resting places they had once been. I stood up and surveyed the place, my gaze resting on Clara's grave one last time. A wave of peace washed over me, a sense that I'd done something good, something necessary. But as I turned to leave, a strange sensation stopped me cold. The soft scent of lilacs filled the air, sweet and fresh. I inhaled deeply, caught off guard. It was the last thing I expected to smell in an overgrown cemetery in the middle of the woods. The scent grew stronger, enveloping me, filling the air with an almost intoxicating sweetness. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone whispering my name. I froze, my heart pounding, and turned back to Clara's grave. She was there, standing just a few feet away, her face cast in shadow but her eyes shimmering with tears. She looked at me with that same haunting gratitude, her lips moving soundlessly as though trying to speak. But no sound came, only silence, thick and overwhelming. I wanted to say something, to tell her I was trying to help, but my voice caught in my throat. My limbs felt heavy, frozen, as if I were rooted to the ground. I could only stare, helpless, as her expression changed. Her gratitude deepened, but her face contorted with sorrow, her mouth opening in a silent cry. And then she was gone, her form dissolving like mist in the evening light. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. I tried to shake it off, tried to convince myself I'd imagined it, that it was nothing more than exhaustion and a trick of the fading light. but the scent of lilacs lingered, clinging to the air like a memory that refused to fade. I forced myself to leave the cemetery, my mind reeling with questions, my heart still pounding. Who was Clara, really? And what had happened to her? The pieces didn't add up. An old family secret, a sorrowful ghost, whispers in the night. But as much as I wanted answers, I knew that whatever story lay buried here went far deeper than I'd realized. Back at home, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, her tearful gaze fixed on me, her silent plea etched into my mind. I kept thinking about the whispers, the scent of lilacs, the sense that I was both welcome and warned away. Her spirit seemed to be reaching out to me, not just as a grateful soul, but as something else, something in pain. I was desperate for answers. I spent hours researching, poring over town records, journals, anything I could find. But the Bellamy family's history was riddled with gaps, odd omissions that made me wonder what secrets the family had kept hidden. Then, I found something chilling. An old newspaper clipping from 1873, the year of Clara's death. It was buried in a stack of old documents from the town's archive, almost as if someone had wanted it to be forgotten. The article was short, almost dismissive. Tragedy struck the Bellamy family when their daughter, Clara, was found dead in the woods near the family home. Details are scarce, and the family declined to comment. Sources close to the family, however, claimed the young woman had been seen acting strangely in the days leading up to her death, speaking of unseen presences and strange visions. Her parents attributed her behavior to an overactive imagination, but townsfolk suspect there may have been more to the story. My skin prickled as I read the words. Unseen presences. Strange visions. Had Clara been haunted in life just as she was in death? The last line of the article stuck with me, repeating in my mind like a warning. Those who knew her say that even in death, Clara Bellamy has not found peace. Her spirit is said to linger in the woods, bound by sorrow and silence. Bound by sorrow and silence. The phrase echoed through my mind as I fell into an uneasy sleep that night, my dreams filled with images of Clara, her tearful eyes following me, her silent pleas growing louder, her face full of a longing that chilled me to my core. The next day, I returned to the cemetery, the weight of the article's words pressing down on me. I didn't know what to expect, but I felt an undeniable urgency to finish the restoration. Maybe, I told myself, if I could complete this project, it would help her find peace. Maybe she just wanted to be remembered, her name preserved, her grave tended to with care. But as I started my work, something felt different. The air was heavier, almost oppressive, and the familiar scent of lilacs returned, stronger than before. I could feel her presence everywhere, watching, waiting, as though she were trying to communicate with me, but unable to break through some invisible barrier. I spoke aloud as I worked, feeling a strange compulsion to talk to her, as if she could hear me. "I'm trying, Clara," I murmured. "I'm trying to help. I don't know what you need." As if in response, a cold breeze swept through the clearing, rustling the leaves and sending a chill down my spine. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me, but I didn't stop working. I cleared the final grave, brushing away the last remnants of neglect, until every headstone stood clear and visible. When I finished, I stood back, admiring the small cemetery in the fading light. The names, worn but readable, felt like a testament to the lives once lived here. I hoped, in some small way, I'd honored them, given them the respect they'd been denied for so long. But as I turned to leave, I saw her once more, standing in front of her grave, her face tear-streaked and her eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't decipher. Her lips moved silently, as though she were trying to speak, her hands raised as if reaching out to me. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she faded into the growing darkness, leaving me alone with the scent of lilacs and the unshakable sense that my task was far from complete. The next few nights were restless. Every time I managed to fall asleep, I was haunted by visions of Clara. She was always there, waiting just beyond the veil of dreams, her tear-streaked face a constant presence. Each dream brought me closer to her sorrow, closer to understanding the pain that bound her here. But it wasn't just dreams. My waking hours were plagued with strange occurrences that made it difficult to focus on anything else. My home, usually a sanctuary of calm, had taken on an unsettling atmosphere. Shadows seemed to shift in ways they hadn't before. Objects moved subtly, just enough to make me doubt my own memory. One morning, I woke to find a trail of soil leading from my front door, as if someone or something had followed me home from the cemetery. The worst of it, though, was the crying. It started softly, just as I drifted off to sleep. A faint sound, as if coming from another room, another place. It would build slowly, filling the silence of the night until it became nearly unbearable. The sound was unmistakably Clara's voice, her quiet, mournful sobs echoing through my empty house. Each night, it grew louder, closer, until it felt as if she were right beside my bed, her sorrow seeping into my very soul. Desperation clawed at me. I knew I had to return to the cemetery. I didn't know what I was hoping to find, but I couldn't ignore the pull any longer. Clara's spirit was reaching out, pleading with me to help her, even if I couldn't understand exactly how. On the fourth night, I returned to the cemetery under a shroud of darkness. My flashlight cut through the thickening mist that clung to the trees, casting eerie shadows that danced and shifted as I walked. The air was cold and damp, each breath forming a small cloud before me. When I reached Clara's grave, I felt an immediate change in the atmosphere. It was as if the very air was charged, thick with an energy that pulsed around me. The scent of lilacs was overpowering, clinging to every breath, and for a moment, I could swear I felt Clara's presence right beside me, her invisible hand resting on my shoulder. I knelt by her grave, feeling a mix of sorrow and dread settle over me. I didn't know what I expected, but I spoke aloud, my voice soft and uncertain. "Clara, I'm here. I don't know what you need, but I'm trying. Please, if you can, tell me what you want." The wind picked up, swirling around the clearing, carrying with it a faint whisper. It was her voice, a faint, broken sound, like a distant echo. "Help me." The words sent a shiver through me. I felt my pulse quicken, and every part of me wanted to run, to escape the weight of her pain. But I stayed, rooted to the spot, compelled to listen. "What happened to you?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. There was silence, then another faint murmur that seemed to hang in the air. "Trapped, bound to this place, betrayed." Her words were fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle scattered across time and memory. I struggled to put them together, to make sense of the sorrow that filled each syllable. "Who betrayed you?" I asked, though part of me feared the answer. But the only response was silence, a thick, oppressive quiet that pressed down on me. The scent of lilacs faded, leaving only the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. I waited, but she did not speak again. Finally, with a heavy heart, I turned to leave. I felt as though I'd failed her, as if I'd missed some crucial piece of the puzzle. But as I walked away, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I turned, my flashlight catching on something partially buried near the roots of the old oak tree that stood watch over the cemetery. Curious, I knelt down and brushed away the leaves and dirt. My fingers closed around something small and cold. A locket, its silver surface tarnished and dull. I opened it, expecting to see a photograph or a name inside, but instead, there was only a small piece of faded fabric, worn and frayed. I pocketed the locket, feeling a strange compulsion to keep it, as though it held a piece of Clara's story, some link to the life she'd left behind. But as I stood, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, a sharp, piercing pain in my chest that made it hard to breathe. It was as if her grief, her betrayal, was passing through me, consuming me from the inside. I staggered back, gasping for air. The pain subsided, but it left behind a hollow ache, an emptiness that clung to me as I made my way out of the cemetery and back to my car. Over the next few days, the locket became an obsession. I studied it, turning it over in my hands, trying to uncover any hint about its significance. But no matter how closely I examined it, it remained silent, refusing to yield its secrets. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow connected to Clara, that it held a part of her story, perhaps even a part of her soul. I found myself returning to the cemetery again and again, compelled by an unseen force that seemed to grow stronger with each visit. Clara's presence grew more intense, her sorrow more palpable. I could feel her anguish, her despair, as though it were my own. Each night, her voice filled my dreams, her whispers becoming more insistent, more desperate. "Free me, please." But no matter how I tried, I couldn't find a way to help her. I was trapped in a cycle of unanswered questions, haunted by her pain, unable to bring her the peace she so desperately craved. Then, one night, everything changed. I was jolted awake by a loud crash, the sound echoing through my darkened house. I stumbled out of bed, my heart racing, and found the locket lying in the middle of the hallway, as if it had been thrown there. But I hadn't touched it. I'd left it on my bedside table, locked away in a drawer. The air was thick with the scent of lilacs, stronger than ever before, and as I bent down to pick up the locket, I felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of sorrow crash over me. It was as if I could feel Clara's presence in the room, her grief filling every corner, her sorrow sinking into my skin. And then I saw her. She stood at the end of the hallway, her face pale and tear-streaked, her dark eyes hollow with pain. She reached out to me, her hand trembling, her voice a whisper that echoed through the silence. "Please, free me." Her words sent a chill through me, and I could feel her desperation, her longing to escape the torment that bound her to this world. But there was something else, something darker that lingered beneath her sorrow. A sense of betrayal, a deep wound that had never healed. As I stared at her, the pieces began to fall into place. The betrayal, the sorrow, the locket, it was all connected. Clara had been abandoned, her spirit bound to the cemetery by some unfinished business, some unresolved pain. And I was certain now that the locket held the key to freeing her. But how? I looked down at the locket, feeling its cold weight in my hand, and a sudden realization struck me. I had been focusing on Clara's sorrow, her suffering, but perhaps the answer lay in the one thing I hadn't considered, the person who had betrayed her. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I returned to the Historical Society, determined to uncover the truth about Clara's death. I pored over records, searching for any mention of betrayal, anything that might explain the sorrow that bound her spirit. Finally, after hours of searching, I found it. A faded letter, buried in an old archive, written by Clara's father. It was brief, but its meaning was unmistakable. "My dearest Clara, I write to you now with a heavy heart, for I have failed you in ways I cannot undo. My shame has bound me in silence, but I know that you must suffer more than I for what I have done. I pray that one day you will forgive me, though I fear you may never find peace until the truth is known." The words left me numb. Clara's own father had betrayed her, condemning her to a life of suffering and a death marked by sorrow and silence. But what had he done? And why had he felt compelled to keep it hidden? The answer remained elusive, but I knew I was closer than ever to understanding the truth. That night, I returned to the cemetery one last time, clutching the locket in my hand. The air was thick with tension, the scent of lilacs stronger than ever, as if Clara's presence were all around me, waiting, watching. I knelt by her grave, the locket heavy in my hand, and whispered softly, "I know now, Clara. I know about your father's betrayal. I don't know all the details, but I swear I will uncover the truth. I won't leave you here." A gust of wind swept through the clearing, and for a brief moment, I felt her presence beside me, a warmth that wrapped around me, filling me with a strange sense of peace. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. I looked down at the locket, feeling a surge of determination. I had come this far, and I wouldn't stop until Clara found the peace she deserved. I left the cemetery that night with a sense of purpose, knowing that the answers were within reach, even as Clara's sorrow echoed through my mind, her voice a whisper that lingered in the darkness. The days that followed were an exercise in survival. Sleep became a luxury I could barely afford. Each night was worse than the last, filled with the suffocating presence of Clara's sorrow and desperation. The scent of lilacs hung in the air wherever I went, clinging to my clothes and filling my home. It was as if Clara's spirit had followed me back from the cemetery, binding itself to me, refusing to let go until her story was told. I became consumed with uncovering the truth, poring over records, revisiting every scrap of information I could find about the Bellamy family. But the more I searched, the more the details of Clara's death eluded me, slipping through my fingers like sand. The only clear fact was the sorrow etched into her father's letter, his unspoken shame, a betrayal that had bound her to a life and death filled with anguish. I returned to the cemetery every evening, compelled by a sense of duty that bordered on obsession. Each night, I would kneel beside Clara's grave, feeling her presence growing stronger, her sorrow intensifying, as though she were calling out to me, pulling me deeper into her world. But one night, I encountered something that went far beyond Clara's sorrow. I sensed a darkness lingering in the cemetery, a presence that felt ancient and hostile, as if the very ground resented my presence. It wasn't Clara. It was something else, something that seemed to guard her, to keep her trapped in an endless loop of suffering. The air grew thick and oppressive, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. I could feel it watching me, its gaze cold and calculating, as though it were assessing my intentions, daring me to go further. That night, I dreamed of Clara again, but this time, the vision was more vivid, more real than any dream I'd ever had. I was standing in the cemetery, the trees looming around me like silent sentinels, their branches reaching down like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the scent of lilacs, and I could hear soft, muffled sobs echoing through the darkness. I turned, and there she was, standing at the edge of the clearing, her face pale and tear-streaked, her eyes filled with a depth of sorrow that tore at my soul. She reached out to me, her hand trembling, her voice a whisper that echoed through the silence. "Please, help me." I took a step toward her, compelled by a need to ease her pain, to free her from the torment that bound her. But as I reached out, her expression changed. Her face twisted with fear, her eyes widening as though she were looking at something beyond me, something terrible. I felt a cold, malevolent presence sweep through the clearing, filling the air with a sense of dread that turned my blood to ice. Clara's hand dropped, her form fading, retreating, as if she were being pulled away by some unseen force. "No!" I shouted, reaching for her, but it was too late. She vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness, the cold presence pressing down on me, filling the air with a feeling of pure, unrelenting malice. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The dream clung to me like a shadow, lingering in my mind, refusing to let go. I could still feel the darkness, the malevolent force that had driven Clara away, a presence that seemed to resent my interference, as though it were trying to warn me away. But I couldn't abandon her, not now. Whatever was keeping Clara bound to the cemetery was something darker than I'd ever imagined. And if I was going to free her, I knew I would have to confront it. The next day, I visited Mrs. Hargrove, the elderly historian who had been my guide through the murky history of the Bellamy family. I had hoped she might offer some insight, some piece of the puzzle that would reveal the nature of the darkness that held Clara captive. When I told her about the locket and the dreams, she fell silent, her face growing pale. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "There are stories, dark stories, about the Bellamy family," she said, her hands trembling slightly. "Rumors of curses, ancient pacts, things that no decent folk would ever speak of. They say that Clara's father, Edwin Bellamy, made a bargain, one that went against the natural order." My throat went dry as I listened, a sense of dread settling over me. "A bargain?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "With whom?" Mrs. Hargrove hesitated, her eyes filled with a fear I had never seen before. "They say he made a pact with a dark spirit, something that dwelled in the woods, a spirit of vengeance and sorrow, something that fed on grief and despair." She looked away, as if the words themselves were a curse. He made the pact to protect his family's legacy, to secure their wealth and power. But there was a price, a terrible price, and it was Clara who paid it. I felt a chill run through me, the pieces of Clara's story falling into place in a way that made my blood run cold. Her father had sacrificed her, bound her to a life of sorrow and silence in exchange for his own ambitions. And now, even in death, she was trapped, held captive by the spirit her father had bargained with. As I left Mrs. Hargrove's house, I felt the weight of Clara's sorrow settle over me, a burden I could no longer ignore. I knew what I had to do. I would confront the spirit, break the bond that held Clara captive, even if it meant risking my own life. That night, I returned to the cemetery, armed with nothing but a lantern and the locket that had once belonged to Clara. The air was thick with tension, the scent of lilacs almost suffocating. I could feel the darkness watching me, waiting, as though it knew why I was there. I knelt by Clara's grave, the locket clutched in my hand, and whispered softly, "I know what he did, Clara. I know about the pact. But I'm here to help you. I won't let this spirit keep you trapped any longer." A gust of wind swept through the clearing, and for a brief moment, I felt a warmth envelop me, a presence that was both sorrowful and grateful. Clara was with me, her spirit drawn to the promise of freedom. But the warmth was quickly replaced by an icy chill, a malevolent force that seemed to seep from the very ground, filling the air with a sense of dread that made it hard to breathe. The darkness had arrived, and it was furious. I could feel its hatred, its anger, a rage that burned with the intensity of 1,000 lost souls. It was the spirit her father had bound her to, the spirit that had fed on her sorrow, her despair, for all these years. "Leave," it whispered, its voice a low, guttural hiss that seemed to echo through the trees. "She is mine." I stood my ground, clutching the locket tightly, feeling Clara's presence beside me, her strength lending me courage. "She doesn't belong to you," I said, my voice steady. "Her spirit deserves peace, not an eternity of suffering." The spirit's laughter echoed through the clearing, a dark, hollow sound that chilled me to the bone. "She is bound to me by her father's will," it sneered. "She is mine to keep, mine to torment. Her suffering is my sustenance, my pleasure." The words filled me with a surge of anger, a rage that burned away the fear. I raised the locket, feeling its cold weight in my hand, and spoke with a strength I didn't know I possessed. "She is not yours. I break the bond that holds her to you. I release her spirit from your grasp, and I condemn you to the darkness from which you came." As I spoke the words, the locket began to glow, a soft, ethereal light that seemed to pulse with Clara's spirit, her essence. The light grew brighter, filling the clearing, pushing back the darkness, driving the spirit back. The spirit screamed, a high, piercing wail that echoed through the trees, filling the night with a sound of pure, unrelenting agony. I could feel its power fading, its hold over Clara slipping as the light of the locket grew stronger. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded, the darkness receding, leaving behind a profound silence. I looked down at the locket, its glow dimmed, but I could feel Clara's presence beside me, a warmth that filled me with a sense of peace and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft, filled with a profound relief. "Thank you for setting me free." I felt a tear slip down my cheek as I whispered back, "Rest now, Clara. You're free." And with that, her presence faded, leaving me alone in the quiet darkness, the cemetery finally at peace. The following day, I returned to the cemetery, half expecting to feel the same oppressive darkness that had haunted the place for so long. But as I stepped into the clearing, I was met with a profound silence, a quiet that felt peaceful rather than foreboding. The air was crisp, free of the scent of lilacs that had so often accompanied Clara's presence. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief settle over me. For the first time, the cemetery felt truly at rest, the graves clear and orderly, the names visible beneath the morning sunlight. I knelt beside Clara's grave, running my hand over the smooth stone, grateful that her spirit had finally found peace. But as I stood to leave, I noticed something odd. Just beside Clara's grave, hidden beneath a tangle of roots and ivy, was a small, unmarked plot. I'd been through every grave in the cemetery during my work, cataloging each name and inscription, but I hadn't noticed this one before. Curiosity got the better of me, and I knelt down, brushing away the debris that covered the plot. Beneath the tangled roots, I uncovered a small headstone, barely visible beneath the layers of dirt and moss. The stone was weathered and cracked. The inscription faded almost to illegibility, but I could just make out a single word: betrayed. A chill ran through me as I stared at the stone, the word echoing in my mind. The revelation that Clara's father had betrayed her by binding her to the dark spirit had been haunting enough. But this inscription hinted at something deeper, something darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, some piece I'd missed. Clara might have found peace, but the spirit that had tormented her, whatever had bound her to this place, felt disturbingly present, as though it lingered in the air, hidden just beyond sight. That night, I lay awake, unable to shake the image of the unmarked grave and the word that had been carved into it with such finality. Betrayed. It was a word heavy with sorrow and anger, a testament to the pain and suffering that had marked Clara's life. As I drifted off to sleep, I found myself in the cemetery once more, standing beside Clara's grave in the pale moonlight. The air was still, filled with an oppressive silence that pressed down on me like a weight. I looked down at the unmarked grave, the word betrayed standing out starkly against the stone, as though it had been carved with a fury that time could not erode. And then, from somewhere in the distance, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone crying. The sound grew louder, filling the air with a deep, sorrowful wail that seemed to echo through the night, surrounding me, pressing in on me from every direction. I turned, searching for the source, but the cemetery was empty, the graves standing silent and still. The crying grew louder, more desperate, filled with a raw, unrelenting anguish that tore at my heart. It was Clara's voice. I was certain of it, but there was something different in her tone, a depth of pain that went beyond anything I'd felt before. "Clara," I called out, my voice trembling. "What is it? What do you need?" But there was no response, only the sound of her crying, filling the air, pressing down on me until it was almost unbearable. And then, in the darkness, I saw her. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her face pale and tear-streaked, her eyes hollow with sorrow. But this time, there was no gratitude in her expression, no relief. Her face was twisted with an emotion I couldn't quite place, something between anger and desperation. "Why didn't you help me?" she whispered, her voice a broken, accusatory echo that cut through the silence. "Why didn't you save me?" Her words sent a shiver through me, a chill that settled deep in my bones. I opened my mouth to respond, to tell her that I had done everything I could, but no words came. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone, leaving behind only the sound of her sobs, echoing through the darkness. I woke with a start, my heart pounding, Clara's voice still echoing in my mind. The dream had felt more real than any I'd had before, her sorrow and anger lingering in my thoughts like a shadow. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that her spirit was still with me, that her plea for help hadn't been satisfied. I'd felt certain that I had freed her, that the curse was broken, but her presence lingered in a way that felt both familiar and unsettling. I returned to the cemetery, hoping to find some sign, some clue that might explain her continued presence. But as I wandered among the graves, the same sense of oppressive silence hung over the place, a quiet that felt almost suffocating. It was as though the cemetery itself held a secret, some truth hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. I found myself drawn back to the unmarked grave beside Clara's, the word betrayed etched into the stone like a scar. As I knelt beside the grave, a sudden thought struck me, a possibility that sent a chill down my spine. What if Clara hadn't been the only one bound to the dark spirit? What if her father, in his desperation to protect his legacy, had sacrificed more than just his daughter? What if others had suffered the same fate? Their spirits trapped in a cycle of sorrow and despair, bound to the place of their death by the same curse. The thought filled me with a sense of dread, a growing horror that settled over me like a weight I couldn't escape. If Clara's spirit had been only one among many, then freeing her might not have broken the curse at all. It might have only been the beginning. That night, I dreamed of Clara once more. I was standing in the cemetery, the trees towering over me like silent sentinels, their branches reaching down like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the scent of lilacs, and I could feel the oppressive weight of the dark spirit, its presence lurking just beyond sight, watching, waiting. And then I saw her. She was standing in the center of the clearing, her face pale and tear-streaked, her eyes hollow with sorrow. But this time she was not alone. Shadows moved around her, figures that seemed to materialize out of the darkness, their faces hidden, their forms barely visible in the dim light. They stood in silence, their eyes fixed on me, their presence filling the air with a sense of despair that was almost palpable. And then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, Clara spoke. "We are still here," she said, her voice filled with a sorrow that seemed to cut through the silence. "We are still bound, still trapped. Please help us." Her words sent a chill through me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness, a despair that seemed to mirror her own. I wanted to help, but I didn't know how. I had thought that freeing her would break the curse, but it had only revealed the depth of the darkness that held her, and the others captive. I reached out to her, my hand trembling, but before I could touch her, she faded, her form dissolving into the shadows, leaving me alone in the darkness. I woke with a start, Clara's voice still echoing in my mind, her plea for freedom haunting me. I knew now that the curse was far from broken, that the dark spirit still held its grip over the cemetery, binding not just Clara, but countless others to a life of suffering and despair. And I knew that if I was going to free them, I would have to confront the spirit once more, to face the darkness that had haunted the cemetery for generations. But this time I would not go unprepared. The morning after my last dream, I woke with a grim determination. Clara's voice had echoed in my mind all night, her words carrying a weight of sorrow and desperation that I couldn't ignore. I'd felt her presence, heard her pleas, and the others, their silent faces filled with a despair that demanded release. It was clear that freeing Clara alone hadn't broken the curse. Whatever darkness lingered over the cemetery was old, deep-rooted, and bound to the place with a force that had taken hold of many souls, not just hers. This curse was anchored in ancient darkness, a spirit that fed off sorrow and despair, growing stronger as it claimed more lives. I knew that if I was to have any chance of truly breaking the curse, I'd need to confront the spirit directly and perform a ritual that would sever its hold over the cemetery for good. I began by researching rituals meant to break curses and release trapped spirits. I scoured books, searching for any reference to spirits of sorrow and ancient pacts, combing through volumes of folklore, historical records, and even occult texts that I'd never have considered reading under any other circumstances. Finally, in a brittle, leather-bound book that looked as though it hadn't been opened in decades, I found something that felt eerily close to what I needed. The book described a ritual designed to sever spiritual bonds and release trapped souls, a ceremony that was dangerous and required absolute focus. The words seemed to leap off the page as I read. The ritual required 3 things: a relic from the spirit's past, offerings of herbs associated with release and peace, and a final, direct confrontation. I had the relic, the locket Clara had left behind, the one I'd felt compelled to take with me. The other components were simple but powerful: sage, rosemary, and lavender, herbs known for their protective and purifying properties. I gathered them, along with a candle and a piece of quartz, and placed everything into a small satchel. Finally, the last part of the ritual, the confrontation. According to the book, I would need to wait until nightfall, when the spirit was at its strongest, and speak directly to it. The instructions warned that the spirit would resist, that it would use every trick it could to shake my resolve, but I couldn't let fear overtake me. I would have to command it to release its hold over the cemetery, to sever the bond that tied the spirits to this cursed ground. As dusk approached, I felt a nervous anticipation, an almost electric charge in the air. This would be the final test, the last chance to free Clara and the others from their silent suffering. That evening, I arrived at the cemetery just as the last light of day faded from the sky. Shadows stretched long across the clearing, and a cold wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. The air was thick with tension, as though the cemetery itself sensed what I was about to do. I knelt beside Clara's grave, the satchel clutched in my hand, and took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. Slowly, I arranged the herbs around the grave, their scent rising in a heady, fragrant cloud that mingled with the night air. I placed the locket on the ground, feeling its cold weight against my palm before I let it go. Lighting the candle, I set it at the foot of her grave and placed the quartz beside it. The flame flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the gravestones, making them appear almost alive. Then I began to speak, my voice steady but low, each word weighted with purpose. "I call upon the spirit that binds this place," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the silent night. "I know you're here. I know the suffering you've caused, the souls you've bound to this ground. Your time here is over. Release them." For a long, heart-pounding moment, nothing happened. The air was still, the cemetery silent. But then, slowly, I felt it. The oppressive weight of the spirit's presence settling over the clearing, a dark, malevolent energy that filled the air, pressing down on me like a leaden blanket. The wind picked up, swirling around me in an icy gust that sent a chill down my spine. A low, guttural voice echoed through the clearing, filling the night with a sound that seemed to seep into my bones. "They are mine," it hissed, its voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "Their sorrow feeds me. Their despair gives me life. You cannot take them from me." The darkness pressed closer, the cold growing sharper, more intense. I felt a wave of nausea, as if the spirit's malevolent energy were trying to force me away, to make me abandon the ritual. But I held my ground, focusing on the candle's flickering flame, letting its light fill my vision, steadying myself against the spirit's assault. "You have no power here anymore," I said, my voice growing stronger. "You were bound here by a pact of betrayal and sorrow, but that bond is broken. Clara's spirit is free, and I command you to release all those you've kept trapped." The spirit's laughter filled the air, a dark, mocking sound that echoed through the cemetery. "You are nothing," it sneered, "a mortal, weak and powerless. You think you can sever my hold over them? You think you can defy me?" The air grew colder, and I felt a pressure around my throat, an invisible hand tightening as though it were trying to choke the life out of me. I gasped, struggling to breathe, the darkness closing in around me, filling my vision with shadows. But then, in my mind, I saw Clara's face, her tear-streaked eyes, her silent plea for freedom. Her sorrow filled me with a strength I hadn't known I possessed, a surge of determination that pushed back against the spirit's grasp. I forced myself to stand, my voice steady and unwavering as I spoke the final words of the ritual. "With this locket, I sever your hold. With this flame, I drive you back into the darkness. And with the power of those who have suffered, I break your bond. Leave this place and release these souls." The candle's flame flared, burning brighter, almost blindingly so, as if it were a beacon cutting through the night. The wind howled, swirling around me in a violent gust, and the spirit let out a scream, a sound of pure, unrelenting agony, as though it were being torn apart. The pressure around my throat released, and I fell to my knees, gasping for air. The candle's flame continued to burn, steady and strong, casting a warm glow that seemed to push back the shadows, filling the clearing with a sense of peace. And then, slowly, I felt the darkness recede. The spirit's presence faded, its malevolent energy dissolving into the night, leaving behind only silence. As I looked around, I felt a profound sense of calm settle over the cemetery, a peace that hadn't been there before. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted, and I knew that the curse had been broken. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. Clara stood at the edge of the clearing, her face radiant, free of sorrow. Her expression was one of pure, tearful gratitude, her eyes shining with a peace I had never seen before. She smiled at me, a soft, gentle smile that filled me with a warmth I couldn't describe. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice like a soft breeze. "Thank you for giving us peace." And with that, she faded, her form dissolving into the night, leaving me alone in the quiet, peaceful clearing. I stayed there for a long moment, feeling the weight of her gratitude settle over me, a warmth that filled me with a profound sense of relief and satisfaction. I had done it. I had broken the curse. Clara and the others were finally free. As I left the cemetery, the first light of dawn broke over the trees, casting the clearing in a soft, golden glow. For the first time, the cemetery felt truly at rest, the spirits at peace, the darkness lifted. And as I walked away, I felt Clara's presence with me, a gentle reminder of the lives I had helped to free, a reminder that, even in the darkest places, there is always hope for redemption and peace. In the days that followed, a quiet calm settled over my life, a stark contrast to the dark and oppressive presence that had haunted me for so long. The memories of Clara and the cemetery lingered, but they felt different now, softened by a sense of peace and finality. Clara's sorrow, her haunting gaze, the scent of lilacs that had clung to me like a shadow. All of it had faded, leaving behind only a quiet memory, a reminder of the souls I had helped to release. I returned to the cemetery a few days after the ritual, not out of compulsion, but out of a need for closure. The clearing felt different, lighter, the air no longer heavy with the weight of despair. The graves stood clean and undisturbed, their stones touched by the gentle light of dawn as though they were being blessed by the rising sun. I walked to Clara's grave, feeling a warmth that filled me with a sense of gratitude and fulfillment. Her grave had taken on a peaceful aura, the stones smooth and unblemished, her name clear and readable in the soft morning light. The locket was still there, resting atop the grave as if it were a symbol of her release, a reminder of the life she had left behind. As I knelt beside her grave, a faint scent of lilacs filled the air, delicate and subtle, a whisper of her presence that seemed to wrap around me in a gentle embrace. I closed my eyes, letting the scent wash over me, feeling as though she were there beside me, her spirit finally free, her gratitude filling the air like a silent blessing. "Thank you, Clara," I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. "Thank you for trusting me. I hope you're at peace." As I rose to leave, I felt a soft, warm breeze brush against my face, like a gentle hand, comforting and familiar. It was as if Clara were saying goodbye, her presence a final gift, a parting message that filled me with a sense of calm. I left the cemetery that morning with a lightness in my step, my heart filled with a profound sense of accomplishment. I had helped free her, had lifted the weight of sorrow and suffering that had bound her to that place for so long. And though I couldn't see her, I felt her spirit around me, a presence that lingered like a warm memory, guiding me, comforting me. Life returned to normal in the weeks that followed, but Clara's story remained with me, shaping my thoughts and actions in ways I hadn't anticipated. I began to see the world through a different lens, one that was colored by an awareness of the lives and stories that surrounded me, even those that had been forgotten or ignored. I felt a newfound empathy for those who had been overlooked, for the souls who, like Clara, had been silenced by the weight of sorrow and betrayal. Every so often, I would catch a faint scent of lilacs, drifting through the air like a memory, a reminder of the spirit I had helped to free. It was as though Clara were watching over me, her presence a quiet, comforting reminder of the peace we had found together. Her gratitude was like a soft echo, a gentle reminder that even in the darkest places, there is hope for redemption and peace. One evening, as I was going through some old papers, I found the letter from Clara's father, the one that had hinted at the pact he'd made, the betrayal that had bound her spirit to the cemetery. I read it again, the words taking on a new significance, a new weight, now that I understood the full extent of what he had done. His shame, his guilt, had been the catalyst for Clara's suffering, but his actions had also set the stage for her release. His letter, his confession, had ultimately led me to her, had given me the means to break the curse and free her from the darkness that had haunted her for so long. In a way, Clara's father had given her a second chance, even if it had taken a century to do so. His words, his remorse, had been the key to her salvation, a final act of redemption that had come full circle in a way he could never have anticipated. I placed the letter back in the drawer, feeling a sense of closure, a quiet satisfaction that Clara's story had finally been told, her life remembered, her sorrow released. One morning, about a month after the ritual, I received a letter in the mail, handwritten on delicate paper and sealed with an old-fashioned wax seal. The letter was from a woman named Lydia Bellamy, a distant relative of Clara's who had heard about the cemetery restoration and wanted to thank me for my work. She had found the graves of her ancestors in better condition than she had ever expected, and she was grateful for the care and dedication I had shown. But it was the last line of her letter that stopped me cold, filling me with a sense of awe and wonder. "I don't know if you believe in such things," she wrote, "but I've always felt that the spirits of our ancestors watch over us, guiding us, helping us when we need it most. I hope that in restoring Clara's grave, you've given her spirit the peace she deserved. Perhaps she's even watching over you now, grateful for the kindness you've shown." I read the line again, feeling a warmth spread through me, a quiet confirmation that Clara's gratitude was more than just a passing feeling, that her presence lingered in a way that was both comforting and profound. In that moment, I felt a quiet, unshakable certainty that Clara was indeed watching over me, her spirit a gentle, protective presence that would remain with me, guiding me, comforting me, reminding me of the power of compassion and kindness. As I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, I felt a soft breeze brush against my face, carrying with it the faint scent of lilacs, delicate and sweet. Clara's gratitude was a presence I could feel, a warmth that filled me with a sense of purpose, a reminder that even in the darkest places, there is always a chance for redemption and peace. In the weeks that followed, Clara's presence became something I felt rather than saw, a warmth that lingered at the edge of my thoughts. Life moved forward, returning to its familiar rhythms, but I felt different. Clara's story, and the weight of her gratitude, had changed something in me. It was as if her spirit had imprinted itself on my soul, her story woven into the fabric of my own life in ways I was still coming to understand. Each time I thought back to the cemetery, I felt a powerful mixture of emotions. The fear I'd felt on those dark, lonely nights was still fresh in my memory, a raw, visceral terror that seemed to creep back into my mind with the simple act of remembering. Yet alongside that fear was a profound sense of compassion, a realization of the power we hold to affect others, living or otherwise. There was something deeply humbling about it, the understanding that my actions, my choices, had reached across the veil of time to ease the suffering of a soul long departed. Clara's sorrow and gratitude had become part of my own journey, a reminder that sometimes the things we fear most are the very things that need our compassion the most. For most of my life, I'd been drawn to places forgotten by time, abandoned buildings, overgrown ruins, hidden cemeteries. I'd thought of them as relics, remnants of the past left to fade and decay, their stories lost to history. But Clara's story changed that perspective in a way I hadn't anticipated. Her presence had forced me to confront the fact that these places weren't just empty shells. They were vessels for the memories, the lives, and sometimes even the spirits of those who had once lived there. And I began to wonder, how many other souls, like Clara, were trapped in silent suffering, bound to the places they had called home? How many stories had been forgotten, left behind in the dust and shadows of history? In reflecting on Clara's release, I felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, an urge to honor the lives that had come before, to remember those who had been forgotten. I wanted to see these places with new eyes, to approach them not just as curiosities but as reminders of the people who had once walked these halls, lived these lives. It was a reminder to treat each place, each life, with the respect and compassion it deserved. One evening, As I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I found myself thinking about fear, about the way it had gripped me in those dark moments, paralyzing me, making me question every step I took in the cemetery. Fear had been a constant companion during my encounters with Clara's spirit, and I'd felt its icy grip with every ghostly encounter, every unexplained sound, every whisper that echoed through the night. But now, looking back, I realized that fear had been a kind of illusion, a veil that had kept me from seeing the truth. Clara had never intended to harm me. Her sorrow and desperation had filled the air with an intensity that felt threatening, even hostile. But underneath it all was a plea for help, a need for release. She hadn't been an enemy. She had been a soul in pain, trapped by forces beyond her control. In the end, it was compassion, not fear, that had broken the curse, that had given Clara the peace she'd so desperately craved. And it was that compassion that I wanted to carry forward, that sense of empathy that had allowed me to see beyond the fear, to recognize the humanity in the spirit that had haunted me. The experience taught me that fear, as powerful as it can be, is often just a shadow, a mask that hides the truth. And sometimes, the things we fear most are simply cries for help, echoes of sorrow and pain that need only a gentle touch, a kind word, to be set free. The memory of Clara's final smile, her tearful gratitude as she faded into the night, remained with me. Her spirit had been released, her sorrow lifted, but her story would live on in my heart, a reminder of the power of compassion and the importance of remembering those who had been forgotten. I began to think about the legacy we leave behind, the stories that shape us, that linger in the places we call home. Clara's story had been silenced, her life overshadowed by her father's betrayal and the darkness that had bound her to that place. But in restoring her memory, in honoring her life, I had given her a voice, a chance to be remembered, to be known. And as I looked out into the darkening sky, I realized that Clara had given me a gift as well, a newfound appreciation for the power of remembrance, for the importance of honoring those who came before us, even if their stories are shrouded in sorrow and silence. The cemetery was peaceful now, its shadows softened by the light of memory and compassion. And as I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt a quiet presence beside me, a warmth that filled me with a sense of peace and gratitude. Clara's story had ended, her spirit freed, but her legacy lived on in my heart, a reminder that even in the darkest places, there is always a chance for redemption and peace. Her tearful gratitude was a memory I would carry with me, a gentle reminder that the past is never truly forgotten, that every life, every story, leaves a mark that can be honored, remembered, and cherished. And as I closed my eyes, I felt the soft scent of lilacs drift through the air, a final gift from the spirit I had helped to free, a reminder that her story, though completed, would remain a part of mine forever. It's been months since I left the cemetery that final morning, feeling the soft brush of a warm breeze against my face, as if Clara herself had whispered goodbye. Her presence has never fully faded, though I've come to understand it not as a haunting, but as a gentle influence that lingers in my life, shaping my thoughts, my dreams, my choices. Some nights, when the house is silent and the world seems at rest, I catch a faint whiff of lilacs, delicate and familiar. In those moments, I feel her with me, a gentle reminder of the peace we found together, the dark curse we'd managed to break. I imagine her spirit at peace now, free to rest after so many years of sorrow, her voice no longer silenced, her memory no longer buried beneath the weight of fear and betrayal. Over time, I've come to see Clara's story as a lesson, a reminder that even the most forgotten souls leave behind a legacy, a mark on the world that resonates long after they're gone. The spirits of the past don't always linger as ghosts in the way we imagine. They can live on in memories, in the quiet places of our hearts, in the small ways they shape our choices and actions. My work with the Historical Society has taken on new meaning. Where once I saw these abandoned sites as mere remnants of the past, I now see them as sacred spaces, places where lives were lived and lost, where stories unfolded in ways we may never fully understand. I've come to believe that every place has a spirit, a memory imprinted on it by those who came before. When I visit other cemeteries, when I walk through their quiet paths and read the names carved into stones worn by time, I feel a quiet reverence, a sense that each grave, each marker, holds a story waiting to be told, a life waiting to be remembered. It's a responsibility I carry with me, an unspoken promise to honor the past, to listen to the voices that linger in silence. Each time I kneel beside a gravestone or touch a worn headstone, I think of Clara. I remember her tearful gaze, her silent plea, her spirit bound to a place of suffering until, through compassion and understanding, we broke the curse that held her there. I remember the gratitude in her eyes, the way her face softened as she finally found peace. It's a memory that gives me strength, that reminds me that even in the darkest places, there is light, there is hope, there is redemption. Clara's story has changed me in ways I hadn't expected. I find myself more patient, more willing to see beyond the surface, to recognize the sorrow that others carry, the silent burdens that so often go unnoticed. I've come to understand that true compassion means facing the things we fear, seeing the humanity in others, even when they appear as shadows or voices from the past. The experience taught me that sometimes the things we fear most are the very things that need our kindness the most. Clara's spirit was bound to a cycle of sorrow and despair, but it was compassion that released her, that allowed her to finally find peace. And that compassion lives on in my heart, a quiet presence that reminds me of the power we hold to heal, to remember, to redeem. One evening, as I was cleaning out some old boxes, I found Clara's locket, tucked away in a drawer where I'd placed it after the ritual. I held it in my hand, feeling the cool weight of the metal, the smooth surface worn by years of time. It was a simple object, small and unassuming, yet it held so much history, so much sorrow and resilience. As I turned the locket over, a thought struck me. Perhaps this locket, this relic of Clara's past, wasn't just a reminder of her suffering. It was a symbol of her release, her freedom from the curse that had bound her. It was a testament to the power of remembrance, to the idea that even in the darkest places, we can find light, we can find hope. I returned the locket to its place, feeling a sense of closure, a quiet peace that filled me with gratitude. Clara's story had ended, but her presence would remain with me, a gentle reminder of the lives that shape us, the stories that linger, the memories that become a part of who we are. As I looked out into the darkening sky that evening, I felt a soft breeze brush against my face, carrying with it a faint scent of lilacs. I closed my eyes, letting the scent wash over me, feeling Clara's presence beside me, a quiet blessing that filled me with warmth and peace. In that moment, I understood that Clara's spirit had been released, that her story had found its ending. But her legacy lived on, not just in the cemetery where she had been laid to rest, but in my heart, in the lives she had touched, in the compassion she had inspired. And as I stood there, gazing out into the night, I felt a quiet gratitude, a sense of peace that filled me with a new understanding of life, of death, of the stories that shape us, the memories that haunt us, and the love that binds us all together. Clara's story had ended, but her spirit would remain with me, a gentle, silent presence that reminded me of the power of compassion, the strength of memory, and the enduring beauty of a life remembered, a soul redeemed. And in the quiet darkness, as the scent of lilacs faded into the night, I felt a final, tearful gratitude for Clara, for her story, and for the gift of remembrance she had given me, a gift that would stay with me forever.